So the key question that I suppose we always ask ourselves when we arrive at an exhibition is, what is all this stuff? You know, what is it that we're looking at here? And it doesn't take long to realize that what we're looking at here is a bunch of more or less recently painted paintings and a bunch of historical, old, black and white photographs. The paintings were done by me. The photographs were taken by a great variety of Soviet photographers, almost all of them professional news photographers, on various assignments in the years between the mid-30s and the death of Joseph Stalin in the mid-50s. The paintings were painted long before I knew of the existence of these photographs, but not before I knew of the content of these photographs. Let me tell you a little bit about how the paintings came about. It sometimes happens that, you know, in the course of your daily work as an artist in your studio, you suddenly find yourself having unaccountably changed course and find yourself making a body of work that you hadn't really expected to make. And why you went there is usually explicable in hindsight. These things are not all that hard to explain, but it was not intentional, it was not planned. And about 12 years ago, I found myself making what I think in the 19th century they would have called history paintings. You know that in the 19th century, the art of painting was divided into genres. There was portraiture, there was landscape, there was still life, and there was history painting. History painting meant the depiction of real or sometimes fictional events that were of some importance historically. They might have been battle scenes, they might have been coronations, etc., etc. This genre has pretty well disappeared, having been entirely replaced by photography. But in written fiction, it still persists. We still have historical novels in which the author, you know, reimagines, recasts some dramatic events in history for the modern reader. Anyway, as I said, sometime about 12 years ago, I found myself working on a painting which depicted an event in the life of a Soviet author, and an author who had a thorny and strange relationship with Joseph Stalin. Joseph Stalin had, incidentally, personal relationships with a great many authors, filmmakers, poets, musicians. He was an omnivorous consumer of art, with the kind of seriousness that people who are brought up without high culture frequently bring to their consumption of high culture when they start to consume it. He was jealous for Soviet accomplishments in the arts to equal those in the West. He was constantly following up on the work of his favorite authors and filmmakers and musicians. And he was accustomed to writing criticism in Pravda, not over his own name, but everyone knew who the author was. And he wrote music criticism, literary criticism, film was his favorite art form. Film criticism, he was not above phoning people in the middle of the night to find out how their latest novel was going, or you know, how the shoot was coming along in Kazakhstan. And these were scary events, because of course the boss had the capacity to make your life very difficult, to make it impossible for you to practice your art, or to be tremendously generous, send extra money to your shoot, or to book a special holiday in Sochi for you to recover from the rigors of writing your poetry. So the rewards and the punishments were serious. Some people prospered, other people disappeared. the odd one here and there was actually simply taken out and shot. And there were a lot of shootings in those years. Stalin's political apparatus was basically chewing up and destroying the early communist cadre with whom he had come up and who had been instrumental in making the revolution. And they were to be sacrificed. Well, so I find myself painting this painting on a Soviet theme, and then comes a second and a third and a fourth. Eventually, I think I painted about 10 or 12 of them, and they were almost without exception. I think I painted one painting on a military theme having to do with the Battle of Stalingrad, but most of the others were depicted Soviet artists in some dramatic moment of their lives having to do with their role as Soviet artists, as public official people. The two who were most prominent for me are two artists for whom I have a great affection and whose work I'm a great consumer of, and that was Shostakovich, the composer, and Anna Akhmatova, the poet. Both of whom lived in Leningrad during the war and survived the siege of Leningrad, which was a terrible siege. I think the siege lasted 2.5 to 3 years, and certainly 2 whole winters, and fully a third of the city died of starvation and cold during that time. The artists were somewhat privileged, received better food rations and firewood, et cetera, et cetera. Both of them survived. And I found myself, quite deliberately choosing some moments in the lives of Pasternak, Shostakovich, Akhmatova, Isaac Babel to portray, to depict. And, if you look up my work, you will see that prior to that time, it didn't look much like this. It was much more improvised and sort of free-handed. But when I started making these pictures, I really felt a compulsion to let the subject be clean and clear and stand up front and, show itself and present itself clearly to the viewer. I think honestly, in the 40 years that I've been painting, in making these pictures, I thought more about you, the viewer, than I ever had until that time, or since then, for that matter. Which makes these paintings, I guess, to some degree, message paintings or more contentful than before. Although I've never actually painted a picture that didn't have a subject. I'm not an abstract painter as such. The series of paintings was completed. Among them, by the way, is the picture that you see on my left, and I'll explain to you the genesis of that. Sometime in my 40s, I read Solzhenitsyn's great history of the Gulag, and I discovered that in the middle of Moscow, in the Hotel Metropole, where my parents and my infant self were living at the time. My father was stationed at the Polish embassy in Moscow after the war. And they had no apartment, so they were put up temporarily at the Metropole, which I'm told is still going as a somewhat now down-market ex-Grand Hotel in Moscow. And so we were living in a 2-room suite there. And reading Solzhenitsyn, I learned that a couple of stories above that, the NKVD, which is the earlier name for the KGB, had a couple of floors which they used as a kind of transit or housing unit for people they had arrested but who had not yet been convicted and sent to their various fates. So, and I began imagining, my little colicky person being carried by my nanny, walked up and down in the halls, while in the elevator, these political prisoners were being taken up and down to their various places of imprisonment. So this is the only kind of autobiographical painting of that series. All the rest are you know, devoted to important Russian artists whose work, you know, I feel closely bound to, and because of my time and place of birth, 48 in Moscow, not a good year, but what were good years in those days, you know, is clearly bound up with my own fantasies about my origins and my parents' relationship to politics, which was checkered, and the relationship of artists to power. That, you know, that's the great theme. And in, you know, in circumstances of totalitarian or authoritarian political power, in some ways the relationship of artists to that power is more clear-cut. You can toe the party line, or you can refuse, you can suffer indignities, you can go underground. Eastern Europe, when I was growing up in Poland, you know, was full of underground theater, underground film. There were ways to escape the authority of government and party. In Russia, in the 20s, 30s, particularly in the 30s, and then of course during the war in the 40s, this was a hell of a lot harder. You know, we have many instances of composers like Shostakovich, whose first opera was blasted by Stalin on the pages of Pravda, which is depicted in one of the paintings you'll see in the show, where Shostakovich gets up in the morning during a tour of Siberia, a piano playing recital tour, and goes down to the nearest kiosk and buys the morning's Pravda and discovers on the second page a critique of his first opera, which had been quite successful in the West. It was actually performed in the West before it was performed in Russia. And Stalin just tore a strip off of the opera and off Shostakovich, declared it to be just noise, not music. Looking back on it, it's clear that Stalin, who was rather prudish, was offended by the sexual content of the opera, but he chooses to talk about form rather than content. And Shostakovich must have known, having read that review, that life was going to become a good deal harder from now on, and indeed it did. So for the next 20 years or so, Shostakovich survived by writing, you know, official music for state occasions, anniversary of the revolution, you know, symphonic works, quote, depicting the struggle of the Russian people during the war, lots and lots and lots of popular songs, some of which were extremely successful, movie music, but the music that he was really invested in, chamber music for the most part, was unplayable in Russia, and it went directly into the drawer, and that's where it stayed until after the death of Stalin, when the music began to be performed in the West, and Shostakovich started to travel a little bit. Ironically, when his music began to be widely disseminated in the West and played in New York and Chicago and London, he was dumped on by Western music critics for having compromised. So not only were his compromises, which were very real, painful to him in his life in the 30s and 40s, but they were mercilessly derided by Western critics who could have had no idea of what life under the Soviet regime was like. Well, that's something about the paintings. Now let me tell you a little bit about the photographs. I had no clue of the existence of these photographs until a couple of years ago, when I was in the process of planning a small retrospective at the MacLaren Art Centre in Barrie, and Ben Portis, the curator there, while sitting over coffee with me one day in the studio, said, you know, the gallery has this amazing collection of Soviet news photographs. And I said, well, what is that? And he said, well, we have some 25,000 black and white photographic prints, which were the Soviet Photo Archive, the official Soviet government photo archive, that was made available through a little boutique in Manhattan from the 30s through the 50s. In fact, almost until the present time, because it was privatized after the Soviet Union ceased to exist. So all these years there was a service which was available to American, to Western journalists who wanted to have a photograph of a particular Soviet movie actor, or a photograph of a sheep farm in the Caucasus, or people on the beach on the Black Sea. You would go to this news service and you would purchase a one-time use of one of these photographs for your publication. So there was this treasure trove of Soviet photographs, official photographs, sitting in Barrie, and my curator said, oh, why don't you come up and look at these things, because we've seen these dozen or so Soviet-themed paintings in the studio. We might do something with these two things together. So I went up there and I spent a long weekend, pouring through these folders of photographs, which were cataloged as to subject, and I must have seen a good 15,000 of them. And I chose about 100, went home to Montreal, started thinking about them, and finally boiled them down to the 50 images that you see here that are in some way connected to the artists and sort of cultural problems that the paintings are about, with a sprinkling of other things that I think are, interesting for their own sake, or as having some part in the background to the work or lives of the artists that are depicted in the paintings. There are some lovely photographs of Gorky, including a fabulous photograph of Gorky and Stalin sort of hobnobbing and having a smoke together. Two old country guys, The photographs are arranged in clusters that are roughly thematic, and beside each cluster we've posted a little card that tells you a little bit about what the theme of that cluster is, and the identifications of the photographs are quoted from the back of the photograph. So you'll notice with some of them that they're clearly sort of official titles. We haven't interfered with those. So for example, there is a photograph of a room full of young Russian military recruits being read to by probably their NCO, who is reading to them an account of the trials, the show trials as they were called in the West, of prominent Bolsheviks that were going on in Moscow at the time. I would think this would probably be about 1937, very likely. That was the worst year for those trials, which were essentially trials for treason of almost all the old Bolsheviks with whom Stalin had come up into prominence. It was a cleansing of that whole generation, which, the paranoid Stalin felt he had good reason to fear their influence. So it's an astonishing photograph. It's the kind of moment that you run into in some Soviet novels. The picture to my left here is the only one of these six that actually depicts a terrifying and tragic moment, which is the interrogation of Isaac Babel by Stalin's own chief prosecutor, Barrie, one of the most feared men in the country, who personally, apparently personally, interrogated Babel. Babel, you have to know, was a a Soviet Jew, journalist, a writer of short stories, who in the years immediately after the revolution, during the Civil War and the invasion of Russia by its capitalist neighbors, attached himself, what's the word we use these days when writers are attached to the military? Embedded. I guess he was embedded. He was embedded with the Red Cavalry, and they, during a number of their actions in Poland and in Russia, and wrote these astonishing stories, which go under the name the Red Cavalry stories, and which they're still in print, you can find them anywhere, and which are amazing and sometimes comical accounts of the lives of these soldiers and the various villagers and townspeople that they meet and the various engagements that they fight. Highly recognized and decorated writer who fell afoul of the authorities through suspicion, which is to say, very likely he had talked to somebody who had been arrested, someone else had seen him talking to someone who had been arrested, and then he was arrested. And that's pretty well the way things went in those days. At any rate, once you were in the clutches of the NKVD and subjected to both physical torture and you know, relentless interrogation, hardly anyone came out of there clean, as it were. And you know, we have to assume that most of the tens of thousands of people who were pulled in had done nothing wrong, but were nevertheless imprisoned and sent to work camps for, there was an expression which was 5 or 10, meaning 5 years or 10 years, which could then be added to following that sentence. And many people simply never came back because the living conditions in these places were horrendous. Anyway, Babel was questioned and never tried, and the next morning he was simply shot in the courtyard of the Lubyanka prison. And well, painting this thing was a particular act of devotion for me. I'm really very attached to his prose, and that's Barrie standing back there. I take care not to paint subjects for which I've seen clear photographs, you know, partly because it's no fun. You find yourself just a prisoner of the image that you've seen. Do you know what I mean? I'd seen the photograph of Babel, which is right up there with his little grandson on his knee. So I knew he was a slightly pudgy, baldish man in his late 40s, but that's pretty well it. Barrie, I had seen a press photograph of Barrie at some outdoor event, a high school field day or something, so I knew he wore glasses and that he was bald. But for the rest, you know, I've made these things up pretty well out of my imagination, and you know, and in each case have tried to invent techniques or technical means of painting that would not seem old hat and boring to me. Painting these pictures, given what I had done for the previous, you know, 25 years, was a hard thing for me to do. And of course, eventually, it went from being a hard thing to do to being a much easier thing to do, and I lost interest and stopped making history paintings. But I hope that the relationship of the paintings, which, as I said, are in a way historical fictions, and the photographs, which are also historical fictions. They're fictions in the sense that they fulfill the mandate of the government to project to the West a kind of image of happiness and well-being, prosperity, peacefulness, cultural attainment that the Soviet government wanted to project to the hostile West. And as Ihor has just pointed out off camera, we were doing exactly the same thing over here. We had the National Film Board of Canada, we had the Australian News Photo Service, and others, private media in the US, as well as many, many media outlets that were secretly funded by the CIA, including opera companies, you know, symphonies, and art exhibitions. You know, we now know how deeply involved the US government was in funding traveling American exhibitions of, you know, difficult vanguard Western art, including stuff that they themselves would probably have quietly derided, but felt that it was good propaganda to show how free and how adventurous American culture was. So we could have you know, put together an exhibition like this from Life magazine and Look magazine, I think just as easily from the other side, and it wouldn't look all that different. So, you know, that period of the Cold War was a time of lying and obfuscation on every side.